All right, go right ahead, Chrissy.
Okay, well, welcome. Thanks for listening in today. As I teach you two different recipes for chocolate sauce, I filmed myself doing this so that I can talk it through as I go here. Um, don't worry, the video itself isn't supposed to have sound, so don't fret when there's no sound for the video. Also, it is sped up to varying degrees to save time, otherwise we will be watching butter melt for 5 minutes. So first thing you want to do is you want to put in some butter. This is the classic sauce first. You want to put in the butter and melt it. This takes the most time, especially if you're like me and you don't bother to cut it up into smaller pieces, but that's fine. Just wait till it melts. You will see that I add the milk too early. There's no reason for this, but it also doesn't hurt anything. It just seems to make the butter take longer to melt if you add the milk too early. The good thing is that the recipe is super forgiving, and so it doesn't really matter that I messed up. Once the butter is melted, you want to dump everything else in and start whisking. So we've got 1/4 cup of sugar and about 1/2 cup of cocoa. I recommend putting the milk in first at this point if you haven't done so already. Otherwise, things might burn. It's just good to get the liquid in first. You might also notice me putting in 2 rounds of cocoa here. Confession time, I never measure anything for this recipe ever. I tried to for this video, but as you can see, that didn't work perfectly. I highly recommend that you go based on your own tastes for how much cocoa versus sugar. I like my chocolate sauce pretty dark, so if you like yours sweeter, feel free to add just the sugar and the cocoa as your taste so choose. General rule of thumb, though, is to keep about the same amount of solid to liquid, so if you add more sugar, add less cocoa. So as you can see, it will look pretty thin and sad at first, and it might be a little bit clumpy. That's normal. Just keep whisking, and I promise it will come together. This is also the point where you could add other things to this sauce if you wanted. I often put a pinch of salt and a teaspoon of vanilla in. That makes it really tasty. You could also go crazier and add some instant coffee, some nutmeg, some chili powder, some cinnamon, whatever floats your boat. Your arm might get tired, I'm sorry, but you do want to whisk it pretty constantly to keep it from burning, and try to whisk it scraping the bottom as much as you can, again, to keep it from burning. You should notice, especially once it starts boiling, that your sauce is getting glossy and that it is noticeably thicker. I usually don't time it, but I try to stop when you can see the trail of the whisk going through. You don't want it like stiff peaks like whipped cream, but you do want it to be not liquid anymore. You can also make the sauce thicker by just cooking it longer, or thinner by cooking it less than a minute. It will continue to thicken slightly as it cools, so bear that in mind when trying to figure out your consistency. Given that it thickens as it cools, I highly recommend pouring it into whatever storage container you're going to be using when it's still really warm. I have a heat-proof silicone spatula, and I usually put it into jars pretty much like now, as soon as it's done. Otherwise, the sides will thicken on and be annoying to scrape off later. Thank you to family friend Sherry for the recipe that was the basis for this. Thank you to my mom for making it more of what you see it as today. So that is the classic sauce. 4 ingredients. It's super easy. The entire filming process, not sped up, took me just about exactly 10 minutes. But I have a friend who has Lyme disease, and she can't have dairy or sugar. What's she supposed to do? So I am going to replace 3 of these ingredients and teach you how to make a chocolate sauce that is friendlier for people who might have some food allergies. You do want to cook this one on lower heat. The other one I usually cook on about setting 5 of 9 on my stove. This one I would go 4 of 9 tops. First up, we're using this thing called aquafaba instead of milk. Aquafaba is that kind of viscous liquid that canned chickpeas come in. It sounds super gross, but I swear it works. It's very weird. Rice milk or oat milk or any other form of like non-milk milk would probably have been slightly tastier and creamier, but I didn't have any. I was working with what I had around my house. And it still worked great. Butter gets replaced with canola oil. I suspect you could use any neutral oil, but I worked with what I had around. Let's talk sweeteners for a minute, though. This is important. Honey doesn't work. It gives it a really weird aftertaste. I don't know why, but it's kind of gross. Don't try it. Agave is better. Maple syrup is by far the best I have found to try with this recipe. Do it if you can afford it. You do want it to start out thicker than the other recipe. It wants to be thicker than water noticeably because this one won't thicken as much. And whisk it constantly or else it will totally burn. It probably won't boil the same way, but it will thicken significantly. And you'll see here, this is about the consistency I want where a spoon dragged through will leave a trail like that. It will also cool a bit as it thickens. Total time on this was less than 10 minutes because you didn't need to wait for the butter to melt. I thank you for listening. If there are questions, I can take a couple of them now, or we can do more questions at the end. But if you have a quick question, let me know.
I have a question.
Yes.
About how long does the regular sauce keep?
If you keep it on the countertop, I wouldn't keep it on the countertop more than like probably 4 days. If you keep it in the fridge, over a week, it never lasts that long at my house.
Right.
I eat it, so I'm not positive.
Okay.
The non-regular sauce, I usually keep in the fridge. It'll keep a couple of days at room temperature, but it will go bad faster than the one that has actual sugar in it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And so the powder is unsweetened?
Cocoa powder is unsweetened, correct. Yeah, that's just regular, like, unsweetened cocoa powder. Like I was saying before we started, you can use a little bit of Dutch cocoa if you want a really rich thing, but I wouldn't use 100% Dutch cocoa in this recipe. I would mix the two. Okay, thanks for listening. I'm gonna bop it over to Kate to hear about some expats.
My screen now. I am switching gears and I'm going to tell you a little bit, just an overview about this couple from the 20s that I have always found very fascinating, called Sara and Gerald Murphy. So diving right in, who are these people? So you have Sara and Gerald. They were a couple that married in 1915. Both of them came from wealthy families. Sara inherited her wealth from her father, who ran an ink and varnish manufacturer. Gerald, his father owned and operated the Mart Cross Company, which made leather goods and sold them. They were neighbors at their houses in the Hamptons in New York, which is where they met. Sarah's a little bit older. She kind of dismissed Gerald at first, but later they said they'd be a good fit. So they got married. They ended up having a daughter and 2 sons. It was expected that Gerald was going to take over the family business, and he did not care for that. He didn't have a head for business. He didn't like it very much. They were both much more concerned with the arts, but he did work there when they were first married for a couple years, but he just wasn't very happy. And his father finally said, well, fine, what do you want to do? And Gerald said, I want to study landscape architecture. So he enrolled in a course for that at Harvard, and they moved the family to Cambridge in 1919. And there they really started getting more active in the arts. They collected a lot of music, they collected art, and they just kind of shifted their focus to that direction. In 1921, they decided they were going to go see bits of Europe. The reasoning being they were going to visit the gardens in England and France. So they set sail in June of that year and went to England, and they did not like England. They didn't stay very long. They cut that part short and they went to Paris, and Paris is where they found their fit. So they arrived in Paris and pretty quickly just established themselves in a social circle, mostly based around the Ballet Russe. They really enjoyed the stage productions that they were seeing there. They enjoyed working on backdrops. They started working on costuming. At one point, they did manage to produce their own production, which you see in the photo at the bottom. Gerald in particular was really inspired by the paintings he was seeing in Paris, and he tried his hand at that. You can see this boat deck picture was a huge painting that he made and exhibited in Paris in 1924. So for someone who kind of dabbled, that's a pretty professional painting. He had a knack for it that he discovered in Paris. Unfortunately, that huge, 18 by 12 foot in dimension, huge painting has somehow been lost. So we only have photographs of it now. So while they were in Paris, they're expanding this social circle in the ballet world and the theater world, hanging out with people like Stravinsky, Man Ray, Cole Porter. Fernand Léger became a really deep, lifelong friend of theirs, and also starting to produce their own art instead of just consuming it. But the thing they're most known for is they started hosting dinner parties. These weren't huge raucous house parties or anything like that. They were small, intimate dinner parties where people could really talk and exchange their ideas, and the connections that were made from there just kept growing and growing and growing. So they kind of established themselves as the center of this social circle. Cole Porter, the musician, ended up bringing them for a summer to the Riviera. He took them to Antibes, which is a small town between Nice and Cannes on the southern French shore. And they loved it. They cleaned up a beach. Gerald took a rake and removed all the seaweed, and they spent their days on a beach at the hotel they were staying at, visiting with friends, hosting friends there, and they absolutely loved Antibes. They decided eventually they were going to buy a house. They renovated it. They called it the Villa America, and they moved in with their family in 1925. They moved in, but they brought a lot of people with them because they were constantly hosting people. And at that time, you didn't show up just for a weekend. You would stay for weeks or months or the entire season. So there were always people around the villa. They were always down at the beach. They were just having this great leisurely lifestyle and producing art, exchanging ideas on art, supporting their friends. So who were these friends? Names you've probably seen and heard of from 1920s literature and art. So F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda were there, hanging out with them. They actually rented their own place in a town next to Antibes after spending a while with the Murphys at their villa. Through the Fitzgeralds, they met the Hemingways. Pablo Picasso was a very good friend of theirs and was around a lot, and he found particular inspiration in Sarah and used her as a model for several paintings and drawings. Dorothy Parker spent quite a lot of time with them and helped them through a rough time that I'll talk about in a moment. And you have other figures in the literary and art world, like the McLeishes, John Dos Passos, and again, Fernand Léger became a really close friend. And these people would share their art, talk to each other. They'd submit drafts they wouldn't really submit them, that sounds so formal, but they would share drafts of their writing with the Murphys. They'd solicit feedback. The Murphys were really supportive of their careers and tried to help them where they could. But all good things must come to an end. So in 1929, their youngest son was diagnosed with tuberculosis. So the family left France and moved to Switzerland in the Alps for 6 months to get him treatment. And Dorothy Parker went with them for much of those 6 months to help them out. So their lifestyle dampened a little bit. They still renovated a little empty building and turned it into like a Swiss chalet party shed sort of thing. So they were still hosting and still kind of trying to upkeep that lifestyle. It was just a little bit quieter. Patrick's health kind of yo-yoed for a few years until 1934 when they decided they would return to New York to care for him in the Adirondacks. And that marked the beginning of a rough stretch for them because unfortunately Patrick succumbed to his TB in 1937 and they unexpectedly lost their middle son in 1935. So Gerald also got a break from working at his father's company for about 13 years, but he did go back and take over as president and stayed in that role till 1955 when he retired. And both Gerald and Sara settled back in Long Island. I know at least for part of that, they were at Sarah's family's home, and they had some stints in Manhattan as well. They didn't really go back for any length of time to the Riviera in France, but they did keep in touch with all of their friends, most of their friends from that time. And we see their legacy in the art and literature that came out of that period. So the photograph up in the top corner is Gerald and Picasso. And that photograph is said to be the inspiration for the painting that's right below it that Picasso did. He also drew Sarah fairly frequently, and the top two images are a drawing and a painting that were based on Sarah's image. And the ones on the right are really interesting. I brought up Léger a few times, and he went and visited the family in the Adirondacks while Patrick was recovering from a bout with TB. The top darker brown image is a portrait of Leger that Patrick drew, and the bottom is the reciprocal portrait that Leger drew of Patrick recovering in his bed. They also show up in literature. The dedication at the bottom in the middle is the dedication from F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night, and he based the main characters in that novel on Gerald and Sara. There is a little bit of controversy there. Fitzgerald was a bit of a volatile person, so they were kind of on and off again with him. And towards the end of that book, the characters turn a little bit unflattering. Some Fitzgerald scholars say it's more of a composite character, with Gerald and Sara being the models for the early part of the book, and Scott and Zelda being more of the model for them later in the book. But they show up a little bit in A Movable Feast by Hemingway as well. Archibald MacLeish wrote a poem about Sara. So they're dotted throughout the art and literature coming out of the 1920s French expat scene. We also have paintings that Gerald did. He kept up, he was pretty meticulous with his painting for about 8 years, 1921 to 29. He was not prolific. There's only about 7 paintings that survive, but they're kind of a precursor to pop art. Big images, really sharp images, stylized images. The 7 that are around are in museums and private collections, mostly in the US. He really enjoyed painting, was very meticulous with it, but after Patrick got sick in 1929, he stopped. So there's only a handful left that we can see. But they're both very interesting people from a very interesting time, and if I have piqued your interest at all, there are some books we can recommend. The first 3 on this list are nonfiction, and I would highly recommend the Amanda Vale book, the first one here. She gives the most in-depth look at what their life was like. The second one talks more about the art that Gerald and Sara were producing and the art that was produced in their social circle. The third one was written by a neighbor of theirs who interviewed them and wrote a short biography. That came out in the 70s, but was reissued by MoMA in 2014. And the last one, if you are not a nonfiction fan, is a historical fiction novel. So you can kind of get a taste with a grain of salt. But I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the chocolate sauce and learned a little bit about the Murphys, really interesting couple. And that's the end of my presentation. And we will be back here next Wednesday at the same time at 12:30. And we're going to be talking about Stephen King's The Shining and how to get celebrity autographs.